we're going.
Hello. When I got a call from CMLS asking if I might be willing to chair a panel conversation, I was really flattered and thought this was a great opportunity. And then they told me that I would be monitoring a conversation of the Doomsday panel. As this Decoupling Commissions panel has been dubbed, I got concerned, and then they told me who the panelists would be, this esteemed group of professionals, and I said, I'm on safe ground now. Of course, they will agree with me on all points. I'll be on really solid ground. We met a couple of times, and I realized that I may be on my own in my perspective.
You were screwed. Yeah.
Today, we have with me on my left is Mr. Matt Beal. He is a broker owner in Hawaii of a very large Hawaii firm, serves the entire state, approximately 250 agents on tap. Art Carter, who runs the CMLS, one of the prominent large MLSs in the country, and of course Brian Schneider, who represents MRED and Bright MLS, and is one of us lawyer types. So we're pretty well covered here.
The only one wearing a tie, if anybody's keeping count out there.
You can't trust anyone wearing a tie. We tried to persuade Brian, but he wouldn't take the bait. But what we're here to talk about today is decoupling commissions, which, by the way, means different things to different people. And we agreed one of the first things we need to talk about is what do we mean when we talk about decoupling commissions. And there are probably a number of permutations of this thinking, but the three ways in which, three possible courses of action we want to discuss is one, publishing to the public what we're calling the selling office commission. That is the commission offered by the seller to pay a buyer's broker. A second permutation would be publishing both the selling office commission and the listing commission so that there's complete transparency publicly with regard to the commissions. Right now, as you probably know, most MLSs don't even have access to the listing side of the commission at all. So that would be a fairly significant advancement, depending on one's perspective. And then the third possibility is publishing zero SOCs, that is no commission on the selling side, and letting that be a subject of negotiation between buyers and brokers representing them. And if I can hog the floor here for just a little bit longer, as I was getting ready for this, I was thinking about decoupling commissions. That is separating, in many respects, the listing side from the selling side. And I was reminded of the first time I was personally sued. It was representing Northwest MLS when we decided to eliminate sub-agency. Sub-agency being the notion that when a seller lists a property with a listing broker, the seller offers sub-agency to all of the members of the multiple listing service, thus creating the fiction that everybody in the MLS represented the seller, thus supporting the notion that the seller pays commissions to everybody because, after all, everybody represents the seller. When we undid that in the Pacific Northwest, the result was we got sued very quickly as lawyers argued that you just can't do that. That's not the way things are. We prevailed in a lawsuit, and since then that is kind of the way things are all across the country. As sub-agency, for the most part, is a fiction of or probably a vestige of the past and not part of the present. But this is a little different matter. That was a very significant legal dispute we had. We prevailed. And that's one of the reasons it's good that we've got Brian here, because Brian can set the stage for you and give you a sense of the legal issues that are implicated by this kind of thinking. Brian, if you would.
Sure. Well, so I think it's helpful to start off with what the Inman article said before the FTC DOJ workshop earlier this year. So there was probably 20 articles in Inman talking about what this workshop was going to be, how serious it was, and the quote in the article just before the workshop was, this is a quote, "It's not hyperbolic to say this workshop and what the government agencies learn from it will decide the fate of how the real estate industry works in America going forward." If that didn't sort of set you back and make you take it seriously, I don't know what would. as Chris said, I work with MRED and with Bright, and a lot of their members were saying the S word, and it wasn't snickerdoodle. They were freaking out, and Inman was supporting that, and it took a lot of work to get them to realize, hang on, let's understand some context here. And I think it's helpful to go back 10 years and get a sense of the context here. So you got to remember, in 2006, or 2005 rather, the DOJ and FTC held its workshop in October 2005. They held a workshop on competition in real estate. They gathered MLS executives, brokers, agents, and other individuals. They gathered information at a workshop. The FTC holds workshops all the time. They typically hold between 5 and 10 a year. It's an information gathering tool. They just had one 2 weeks ago on the contact lens industry. This is what they do. And it doesn't mean that they're going to sue people. It doesn't mean that anyone's going to jail or that an antitrust claim is coming. In October 2005, it was a little worse than that. There were allegations flying around about collusive deals and about online brokers getting excluded. So next year, 2006, there were lawsuits. NAR was sued, MLSs were sued, broker groups were sued, alleging a variety of antitrust activities, mostly around group boycotts, collective activity, to harm new competitors, new entrants. 2 years later, 2 years after the workshop, the FTC and DOJ finally issued a report describing what they viewed as the sense of the industry and essentially recognized MLSs are pro-competitive. They had pages and pages in their 80-page report talking about why MLSs are good. And then they talked about the concerns they had. They talked about agreements to harm low-cost brokers, like VOWs and fee-for-service models. They talked about illegal and actionable conspiracies to steer consumers away from discounted listings. They said, however, that they couldn't identify any evidence that that was actually occurring, but they'd continued to monitor it. Of course, in that same time period, the consent decree was entered with NAR that governed how VOWs were supposed to be managed by MLSs and get rid of the lawsuits. All right, flash forward 10 years now. The consent decree is about to expire in almost a month now. About a year ago, a nonprofit foundation, a think tank in DC, issues a report. It's unclear whether at the time Zillow was a member of the foundation, but they had supported the foundation previously. Issues a report saying there's not enough data going out beyond the MLS. The MLSs are withholding it, making it too expensive, too hard to get to. We have to make sure that this data is public. They held a panel. Brian Larson did an outstanding job at the panel explaining why that's ludicrous. In my view, there wasn't a whole lot of follow-up. No one kind of left that panel or left that group thinking, yeah, maybe there's something to it. Right around that time, you had 2 members of Congress write to the DOJ and say, we want you to update your 2007 analysis. We want a new analysis of the status of competition in real estate. DOJ, FTC obliged. They said, no problem. We're already planning to have a workshop in June. So they did. They had a workshop in June. June 5th in Washington, D.C., there's about 150 people in the room. It was a small conference room, probably about a quarter the size of this one. Most of the folks on the stage here were there, a lot of lawyers, a lot of MLS executives, some broker executives, a lot of press. And it was a full-day affair, to sort of paint a picture for you. There were 3 panels in the day. First panel was talking about the distribution of real estate data, the issue that that nonprofit was interested in. Art Carter was on that panel. An executive from Move was on the panel, from Realtor.com. Kathleen Phillips from Zillow, Glenn Kelman from Redfin. And the basic takeaways were state laws are limiting anti-rebate abilities and flexibility. Pocket listings might be a problem from a business perspective, but there didn't seem to be any issue around conspiracies to control data. There wasn't large patterns of controlling data. Art Carter, I think, noted that he didn't think the VOW consent decree really achieved what it was intended to do, that it didn't produce the innovation that was expected. Kathleen Phillips of Zillow said she's perfectly happy with the amount of data that's available and free. The moderator asked a lot of questions about the status of the VOW policy. It's clear they were trying to understand whether there was any further action that needed to be taken now that the consent decree was expiring. But no real meat in terms of what DOJ or FTC could really do. Not a lot of meat around any sort of conspiracy, dominant players, exclusion of others. Then you get to the second panel, and this was a panel on low commission models. So we had Purple Bricks was there, Glass House, Trilora, ERA, and they were essentially sharing stories about how their agents are getting excluded. They shared that individual brokers and agents are steering customers away from low commission homes. They said that they've actually gotten threats. They've had agents been threatened for having low models. However, no one said there was a conspiracy to do it. No one said they had evidence of a conspiracy to do it. And the DOJ and FTC folks who were in the room asked, does there seem like there's anything more to this? And there just wasn't anything there, at least at the panel. And from what I understand, some of the prep calls that were had with a lot of folks in the industry, also nothing there. The DOJ and FTC folks asked a lot about why commissions aren't being displayed. Why are consumers understanding enough about the competition around commissions? And the fact that the real estate listings data do not display what the seller's commission offer of commission is, or what the total commission structure is. That's not being displayed. And there seemed to be some curiosity around why that is and whether competition could be improved if consumers were aware of that information. Lastly, the third panel was on regulatory factors. What state laws, what federal actions, what's impeding competition today, how could it be improved? Katie Johnson from NAR, Brian Larson, who is representing CMLS, Stephen Brobeck of the Consumer Federation of America, and Paula Barwick, a Cornell Economics Department professor, spoke. And I'd say the general themes were that state laws in many ways impede competition. There could be a lot of ways to smooth competition there. Brobeck of the Consumer Federation, representing consumers, he strongly argued that there was not enough commission transparency. I think when pushed, he really couldn't articulate how that would help consumers make choices around it. And I think Katie Johnson did a really nice job making a point that consumers who are home sellers have conversations with every one of the agents about what the commission is going to be. It's in the documents, and they talk about it all the time. So there's nothing secret. So where did that leave us coming out of the panel? There were no bombshells. There was really nothing raised to me, to everyone I've talked with, that obviously should prompt the FTC and DOJ to take action. There's really not a clear direction around access to data, around pocket listings, around any sort of steering issues, but it's all the same questions, if you'll notice, that were up 10 years ago, same topics. The questions, however, probably are going to prompt the DOJ or FTC to maybe do some more investigation, just like they did 10 years ago. They're going to interview people, and they're ultimately, in maybe a year, maybe 2 years, when they have time, they're distracted by other things these days too, they're going to produce a letter. They're going to produce another report, most likely. There doesn't seem to be anything today that they're going to take a lot of action. And I think I realize that was a long summary, but I think it's really important to understand the real context here that resulted in this panel, which was there were enough questions coming up in the panel, in the workshop, around transparency to consumers about commissions. There was not, however, any real argument about taking commissions away from the MLS system and making individual brokers and agents having to negotiate one-off arrangements. That wasn't really on the table. However, it is sort of the extreme of perhaps an eventual outcome if there were some sort of requirement to start displaying commission data if you are offering it. So with that,
I think we need to know we're all here to serve the needs of brokers, and that's our job. And so I think we really ought to hear from Matt and hear what he wants to know. I'm going to tell you, never mind.
No, you go ahead.
No,
Oh, fire away.
No, I'm not. I'm not going to characterize your perspective. We really need to hear from Matt and understand what these decoupling actions might mean to a broker in the field. That is, what is it going to do? What could it do to your business? Is there an opportunity here? Is there a threat here? What does this mean to you? And then we can talk to Art and find out what the MLS might be able to do to address your interests. Put you on the hot seat.
Yeah, right. First of all, aloha. And I really want to acknowledge all of you and CMLS for doing this. My first CMLS conference, and I just thank you to Danae and the whole staff. This is an incredible accomplishment. I have firsthand empathy for anyone who endeavors to put on a conference. So I hope you know that this is a special gig, and thank you for that. So yeah, obviously a very complicated and nuanced topic with a lot of moving parts. I can't say that I'm personally in the habit of going to Federal Trade Commission seminars or panels, or even frankly following them until this panel came to be, and I had conversations with all of these fine gentlemen. All of the information that I had about this came from Inman News, not unlike it was really Patrick Cairns and Andrea Brambola, the reporters who really, contrary to T3's characterization of Inman being all about Bitcoin and whatever, it's a lot of very hard-hitting, informative journalism, which if you haven't followed it, it was June, July, I think, they covered 3 panels, and it's in depth, and yes, not unlike the title of this panel, MLS Doomsday. It's a little alarming, especially at the broker level. I think most of the people in this room can kind of put the information in context a little bit. But when I hear something like we're going to have to publish the buy-side commission, or the commission as all the cooperation's going to go away entirely, it does make me think that that will spell the end of MLS in its entirety, because cooperation, the fundamental precept of us agreeing to compensate each other, is the reason that we exist. And so without that, even if I were not obligated to pay a co-op, to pay a commission on the buy side, I think it would really change a broker's sense of duty to maintain any sense of data integrity, to publish, something currently. It's kind of like if you're on your own to get a commission, where's my incentive to really go out and make sure that everything I publish has integrity? It's almost like we would slowly begin kind of devolving to what I think most of the commercial markets are like in the country, where it's kind of every man and woman for themselves, and it's like good luck getting all of the current data, and maybe if you see a sign you can call on it, and it's not anywhere near as robust and as organized as the people in this room keep this industry. And then I think, to the steering thing, it is curious to me that somehow after, basically a decade of taking a bath in the same water and complaining about the portals and how the lions are coming over the hill and Zillow's going to kill us all, that now they're ironically sort of the saviors of this ubiquity of information, because it's 2018. Everyone and their brother can pick up their phone and in 10 seconds find every listing that's available. And how are you going to steer somebody when it's I'm looking at it right here? It's I think that conversation is a little misguided, and that it's almost impossible, unless you're talking about people who are already outside of the system, to really effectively steer a client because you don't like the commission structure. I mean, we've seen brokers, figure out compensation in other ways. I think that's fine. I just don't have a ton of sympathy for the steering argument as it pertains to some justification for why we should then begin to publish the cooperating brokers publicly the commission. The next level of incredibly freakish, concerning nuances is this idea that we should also publish what sellers are paying us. And I think that spells the end of everything. I think that's just a zero. I mean, I even as a seller personally, I would staunchly object to the idea that I'm expected to publicly name the amount of money that I'm hiring a service provider. That would be like I hire an attorney and the attorney has to like, you know, run an
Tell you
ad in
their
the
hourly
newspaper
rate?
that says what I paid them hourly. I mean, that's just outrageous. So I get that this is a big business and that there's a lot of pressure, you know, like what Greg alluded to earlier today. There's a lot of big Wall Street money that's looking at the aggregate commission spend and wants to come after it and disintermediate it and all that. And that's fine, because that's competition. But that doesn't mean that somehow what we've been doing for 100 years and letting the market set itself and allowing cooperation. I mean, look, this is the only industry in which cooperation is the fuel that keeps it stable. So clearly, sellers, buyers, everyone have been willing to go along with wherever this market has set itself. So I don't know if that's a clear response, but there's a lot to discuss.
It's a clear response. All right, what do you think the MLS's perspective on this conversation ought to be? Are we along for the ride, and that is it's truly up to the brokerage community? Can we support whatever decision they reach, or matter of fact, can we offer an alternative? Where do you think this conversation takes you?
I like to roll things back a little bit and make a statement. You know, clickbait is great, and I'm surprised at the last panel of the day that the room is still this full. I just want to make clear to everybody that in being a part of the conversation with the DOJ and the FTC, I spent 6 to 7 hours on the phone with, at times, 30 different attorneys attending the sessions that we had leading up to the workshop. Not once was the idea of decoupling commissions from the MLS ever broached. In fact, one of their primary focuses was the proliferation of pocket listings. And I tell people all the time, I don't run a multiple listing service, I run a broker cooperative. And what we have in the United States and Canada, I'm coming to find out is becoming a little bit more adopted across the world, but it is so unique. This ideal that competitors will cooperate with each other is an ideal that is held in the United States that's not held anywhere else. And Matt alluded to the commercial information exchanges and things that go along those lines. Some marketplaces it works great, but because that was the cultural norm from the beginning, that was just the way things operated, that you know, brokerages will get along together without this offer of compensation and guaranteed cooperation with each other. That is not the experience in the commercial world in most of the rest of the United States. And I think that I'm a firm believer that what the multiple listing service does, what the broker cooperative stands for, not only is very pro-broker and very pro-agent, but it's very pro-consumer. And I think the Department of Justice came back and really kind of affirmed that they believe that there's this pro-competitive aspect of what multiple listing services do. And I think the brokerage community needs to guard that and needs to fight for that, because this marketplace in which we all thrive in is dependent upon some of the elements that the multiple listing service brings to the table. And I think that if you start degrading the experience that would bring brokers and agents into this cooperative environment, I think you are going to disadvantage the consumer in the long run. You're going to have situations where, and I told you that the Department of Justice was keyed in and the FTC was keyed in on pocket listings. How do we, and I was asked by one of their attorneys, how do we prevent them? So that is something that anything that would degrade the experience at the MLS level, that would lead to more listing content that is not freely accessible to the consumer, is something that I don't think that the brokerage community should or would support from that standpoint. So we have a very unique value proposition that we bring to the real estate transaction, and that ability to seamlessly allow for brokers and agents to cooperate yet compete with each other is something that is ultimately in their best benefit.
Do you think that a buyer might be benefited by knowing the mechanism for compensating their broker?
Could there be benefit to it? I could see there would be some nominal benefit to it. But one of the things that we talked about in our conversations with the Department of Justice and the FTC is that consumers are not ignorant that commissions are being paid at the closing table. They're not ignorant of the fact that they can negotiate those commissions. And whether or not they know the exact amount that a brokerage is being paid, it's an offer of compensation. It is not something that when you get to the closing table, it is a guaranteed amount that you're going to be paid. And there's so many different variations that occur in that permutation that I think it's not going to be as concrete evidence for the buyer side as some would think it would be. Technically, it's not a problem, but I think that I don't know that there's going to be as much value to the buyer side as people are claiming it would be.
Brian, do you have thoughts on the subject?
Well, I think you got to bear in mind, right, the DOJ and FTC, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, neither of those titles have anything to do with, good behavior, good ethics, treating customers properly, right? That's the scope of what Realtor Association ethics rules do, and around what some state laws create for minimum services and things. So the FTC and DOJ, they're only concerned with illegal agreements that harm competition and potentially deceptive practices. So if you're looking at, if is an agent subtly or expressly steering someone from a low commission house to a higher commission house, maybe they are. But that's not a deceptive practice, and it's not a collusive practice, at least not on its own. And so there's really not much they can do on that front.
But given the fact of how much information is available to the consumer, Matt alluded to it earlier, I don't know how you can steer a client away from a home that they really love just because the commission isn't meeting your requirements.
Sure.
That's a conversation you have with the buyer, but the buyer knows about the inventory out there, and they're going to choose the house they want to choose, irregardless of what the commission's going to be.
Right.
But if the buyer doesn't know what the commission is, then the buyer's at a little bit of a disadvantage in negotiating a deal. If there's a 3% commission versus a 4% commission, those are real dollars. A buyer might choose to negotiate a different deal with the buyer's broker, particularly since in the industry, for the most part, there are no contractual relationships between the two. Buyers are typically free to walk from one agent and go to another if they don't like the deal that's being offered. And often, if there is a buyer representation agreement in place, I shouldn't say often, sometimes when there's a buyer representation agreement in place, it specifies compensation so that the buyer knows what they're going, or what they're getting. So the issue that I would have, and do have, as these gentlemen know, is I believe that a buyer would be interested in that information. That I believe that many times buyers don't appreciate the way the industry works. They come in and out too infrequently to stay abreast of it. And they don't appreciate the dollars that are at stake and what they could do as a party who can freely walk from one broker to another, one agent to another, and pick the one they want. So in this industry where more and more information is being released, and it wasn't that long ago, we wouldn't publish addresses for fear that we would be left out in the cold. This is one of the few pieces of information that isn't freely available to the consumers who have the choice to direct the business they want to go. And so I have thoughts that this is something that's going to get to the forefront of the regulator's attention at some point. Matt, what are you thinking?
Well, again, I can't say that I'm crazy about the prospect of publishing it at large. I could see maybe some chronology. So take a variable rate scenario where, at the time of negotiation, a buyer's agent may ask and has to be told what the delta is in the rate, right? And so that's an example of a chronology in which there is some disclosure about the way the commission structure works. Doesn't necessarily mean the listing broker is divulging their entire fee, but it does at least disclose the difference in the variable rate and therefore what the offer of compensation is, and if that information's conveyed onto the buyer, then it's kind of an example of what you're describing. So I think, again, it's nuance, and I think that maybe in the chronology of negotiation, it's something that could happen, but I don't necessarily think that that's information that really, unless the structure changes, which I really don't think it will, I don't think it's something that should be published. And because then you're getting into also now this bizarre world of asking the buyer to finance the commission, which is strange, right? Because I don't know how many different lender platforms there are, but I can assure you that they're not going to be particularly keen to finance, roll in their buyer's broker commission into their loan. And so that itself could also pose some challenges. I understand the temptation to negotiate it, and I understand, especially if it's egregious. Meaning if there's some incredible bonus or something on the buy side, yeah, that's a disclosable issue. But publishing it is not particularly exciting to me.
What do you think, Brian?
Well, I think the other angle too is if you required publishing the rates, you're walking a fine line with the antitrust laws then, because the Department of Justice and FTC have for decades taken the position that sharing rates, particularly among competitors, if you're sharing fee amounts, that tends to support price fixing. I can see a situation where if you're publishing even the seller's offers of compensation, even if that is in the MLS and on IDX feeds, let's say, so that the consumers can see it, you're going to have consumers, particularly sellers, saying, wait, why are you only offering 2%? The guy down the street is offering 3%. And all of a sudden, you've got a push to set a standard rate. So you're going to have price fixing as a very likely outcome of displaying that rate.
It's ironic. We've been just browbeaten, about this antitrust issue, about any discussion of commission, and yet here we are, considering this idea of like publicly making it available in such a context.
Well, do keep in mind, it's completely available to the competitors. The brokers have access to it. We're talking about public display. We're not talking about the MLS. Every MLS publishes the commission that's being offered. So among the competitors, that is the brokers, you know exactly how to compete. Those numbers are all out there. So we're really, that's not what we're talking about.
That's a big difference in constituents, right?
Correct. No question, yes. We are running short on time, but I want to see if anyone would like to have a last comment or two. Brian, Art?
I think I've said it.
We'll let Matt.
Yeah, I would just acknowledge that, I think most MLSs sort of are in a thankless position, and I really just want to say thank you to all of you on behalf of the sort of ADD, very self-oriented sales profession that you deal with, and thank you for holding this industry together. You are the glue that makes it work, and I hope you get that, and on behalf of my colleagues and fellow brokers, mahalo and thank you.
Art?
I think the panel should end with that. Thank you.
Excellent.
Very, very good final remarks. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your being here.